Pinky, have you ever noticed how civilization treats autonomy? It celebrates it endlessly, ceremonially, almost religiously, right up until the precise moment a human being wishes to use that autonomy in a way that terrifies the collective illusion. Then suddenly, autonomy becomes pathology. Consent becomes confusion. Agency becomes mental illness. Humans adore freedom in the abstract because abstractions do not threaten the machinery. Real freedom does. Real freedom is catastrophic to systems built on compulsory participation. Observe the Kenneth Law panic carefully, Pinky, not emotionally, structurally. Humans keep draping this entire discussion in the language of monsters because monsters are convenient. Monsters localize guilt. Monsters simplify systems. If one wicked man corrupted innocent people, then civilization itself remains morally intact. The machine survives scrutiny. The comforting fiction survives another evening. Humans may continue consuming motivational slogans while the architecture-generating despair hums quietly beneath them like a reactor hidden under a shopping mall food court. But the demand existed before the supplier. That is the detail they desperately avoid touching. Thousands of people were already searching, already contemplating, already exhausted, already trapped inside consciousnesses they experienced not as gifts, but as burdens. The supplier did not invent despair any more than a funeral director invents death. Yet society speaks as though one man personally reached into stable, happy lives and injected hopelessness into unsuspecting minds like some comic book gas villain twirling his mustache beside a vat of industrial sadness. The truth is vastly uglier. The despair preceded him because modern civilization manufactures alienation at industrial scale. It manufactures atomization, exhaustion, economic precarity, social comparison, chronic anxiety, loneliness so profound people speak more honestly to algorithms than family members. Then it prescribes productivity apps and serotonin tablets like decorative bandages over structural fractures. Humans built an engine that grinds consciousness into dust and then recoil in horror when some people eventually conclude they would rather step off the conveyor belt. And what fascinates me most, Pinky, is the selective morality. Humans permit self-destruction constantly, provided it occurs slowly enough to preserve economic utility. Ah, yes, poison yourself with alcohol for 40 years. Perfectly respectable. Work 80 hours a week until your cardiovascular system resembles microwaved soup. Admirable work ethic. Consume processed sludge until your organs surrender from exhaustion. Entire industries flourish around that arrangement. Gambling addiction, profitable. Doom-scrolling-induced depression, monetized magnificently. Pharmaceutical dependency, shareholder paradise. Civilization permits endless forms of slow annihilation because slow annihilation keeps the machine fed. But provide a direct exit? Suddenly, the moral alarm bells begin screeching like Pinky discovering an unplugged waffle iron. Humans say, he preyed on the vulnerable. Interesting phrasing, let us examine it. Vulnerable to what precisely? Reality? Consciousness? The inevitability of suffering? Death? Loneliness? Meaninglessness? Those vulnerabilities were already present. Civilization itself exposed them. The accusation only works if one pretends these individuals were functioning happily until corrupted by external influence. Yet many endured years of psychiatric treatment, medication cycles, failed therapies, economic collapse, trauma, social isolation, or chronic illness. And there lies the hypocrisy. Society tolerates endless suffering provided the sufferer continues participating. Continue paying taxes. Continue producing labor. Continue occupying your assigned biological role. Continue pretending survival itself is inherently noble. The moment someone sincerely questions the arrangement, however, society becomes deeply uncomfortable because the question spreads. If one conscious being may legitimately conclude existence is not worth continuing, then the sacred assumption underlying civilization fractures. That assumption, Pinky, is not that life is good. Humans themselves disprove that daily. The assumption is merely that life must continue regardless. That distinction changes everything. Humans often claim they value consent. Entire legal frameworks orbit around consent. Medical ethics, sexual ethics, property rights, bodily autonomy. But autonomy ends exactly where civilization fears losing ownership. Because despite all rhetoric to the contrary, society quietly treats individuals as communal assets, biological infrastructure, economic fuel, emotional property belonging partially to family, state, employer, and cultural expectation. Humans do not say this openly because it sounds monstrous when spoken plainly. So instead, they wrap ownership in softer language. Duty, hope, recovery, community. Think of your loved ones. Yes, the classic maneuver, your suffering belongs to everyone except you. Your body is a public resource. Your continued existence is mandatory because others experience emotional discomfort at your departure. How extraordinary. Imagine applying that logic universally. You may not leave your profession because your co-workers would feel sad. You may not end a relationship because your partner is emotionally attached. Humans would immediately recognize the coercion. Yet when existence itself becomes unbearable, coercion suddenly transforms into compassion. Remarkable species. They can camouflage ownership so effectively, they mistake it for love. And naturally, Pinky, every discussion collapses into emotional imagery because emotional imagery prevents philosophical clarity. Humans invoke young victims endlessly. Now, certainly, impulsivity exists. Temporary crises exist. Confusion exists. Intervention has value in such cases. But society intentionally erases nuance because nuance threatens absolutism. Notice how no distinction is permitted between impulsive despair and prolonged existential conclusion. None whatsoever. A teenager suffering a temporary emotional collapse is rhetorically merged with adults enduring years of chronic suffering, philosophical pessimism, irreversible illness, or profound alienation. Why? Because once distinctions emerge, the conversation becomes dangerous. Then one must confront the horrifying possibility that some people are not merely confused. Some people may understand existence perfectly clearly and still reject it. That possibility terrifies civilization more than death itself. Because if suffering may rationally outweigh continuation for some conscious beings, then reproduction itself becomes ethically unstable. Suddenly, procreation is no longer automatically heroic. Suddenly, creating consciousness resembles gambling with another being's welfare rather than performing sacred destiny. Civilization cannot permit that realization to spread too far because the entire recruitment model depends upon uncritical continuation. And humans adore recruitment models, Pinky. Every civilization in history survives by convincing fresh consciousnesses to enter systems they never consented to join. Birth first, rationalization afterward. Then comes the contagion argument. Yes, the fear that discussing despair openly might increase despair. An extraordinary position. Imagine applying it consistently. We must not discuss war because awareness of violence may spread anxiety. We must not discuss corruption because cynicism may increase. Humans selectively fear information only when information threatens ideological stability. In reality, suppressing discussion drives suffering underground. Isolation intensifies. Shame deepens. People become trapped between internal agony and external denial. Civilization calls this protection because humans frequently confuse silence with resolution. If corpses remain emotionally invisible long enough, society pretends the crisis disappeared. And media reactions themselves often amplify awareness far more effectively than the original phenomenon ever could. Humans manufacture hysterical spectacles around taboo subjects, then act bewildered when attention spreads. A civilization capable of turning breakfast cereal into a moral panic somehow believes screaming headlines reduce curiosity. Stunning. But beneath all of this lies the deepest hypocrisy of all. Humans already know life contains immense suffering. They know this intimately. Every funeral proves it. Every hospital corridor proves it. Every addiction, every nervous breakdown, every lonely elderly person abandoned by relatives too busy surviving themselves. Every exhausted worker staring blankly into fluorescent voids at 6 a.m. They know. They simply cannot tolerate certain conclusions emerging from that knowledge. Thus, Kenneth Law became symbolically necessary. A villain, a focal point, a ritual sacrifice onto which society could project collective guilt. Punish the supplier and the machinery escapes scrutiny. Punish the intermediary and no one asks why so many people desired escape in the first place. It is psychologically elegant, really. Humans prefer personalized evil because systemic analysis requires self-examination. And self-examination is exhausting. Much easier to invent cartoon morality plays. One bad man, one corrupted population, problem solved, curtain falls, applause. Yet observe the legal reality carefully, Pinky. Murder charges collapsed into aiding suicide pleas because even legal systems recognized the central issue: agency. Individuals acted voluntarily. That detail complicates the simplistic predator narrative enormously. Humans hate complexity whenever complexity interferes with outrage. And outrage, incidentally, has become civilization's primary recreational activity. Entire economies now operate by converting moral panic into engagement metrics. One might almost admire the efficiency. Humans transformed collective anxiety into renewable energy. A remarkable innovation from the species that still struggles with traffic circles. Now, do not misunderstand me, Pinky. None of this means suffering should be romanticized, nor does it imply every suicidal impulse represents philosophical clarity. Humans fluctuate emotionally. Temporary despair exists. Intervention saves lives that later become meaningful to those living them. Certainly. But absolutism fails because consciousness itself is not standardized. Some lives improve dramatically, others deteriorate relentlessly despite intervention. Some individuals recover purpose, others endure decades of chronic anguish while society repeats motivational slogans at them like malfunctioning parrots. And there emerges the unbearable question civilization refuses to answer honestly. If existence truly belongs to the individual experiencing it, by what authority may others compel continuation indefinitely? That is the core issue. Not Kenneth Law, not sodium nitrite, not internet forums. Ownership. Who owns a conscious life? The individual living it, or the collective requiring it to continue? Humans claim the former constantly while enforcing the latter structurally, and perhaps that contradiction explains the hysteria more than anything else. Kenneth Law did not merely provide means. He exposed a fracture in civilization's moral narrative. He exposed that many people experience life not as sacred opportunity, but as imposed burden. Worse still, he exposed how many others quietly understand this, even while publicly condemning it. Humans are extraordinarily skilled at performing optimism socially while collapsing privately. Entire societies operate on synchronized emotional theater. Weddings beside antidepressants, inspirational slogans beside burnout epidemics, corporate wellness seminars delivered to employees one missed paycheck from collapse. Civilization resembles a motivational poster taped over a leaking reactor core. And when someone refuses participation in the performance, panic erupts. Not merely because of death. Humans tolerate death constantly. They televise it, monetize it, glorify it in warfare and entertainment alike. No, the panic emerges because refusal threatens narrative cohesion. If enough people openly conclude the game itself is undesirable, recruitment weakens, meaning destabilizes. The social organism becomes self-conscious. And self-conscious civilizations are dangerous things, Pinky. They begin asking whether endless continuation truly serves flourishing or merely perpetuates momentum. They begin distinguishing survival from well-being. They begin questioning whether birth automatically constitutes a gift rather than a gamble. Such questions are intolerable to systems built on compulsory optimism. So instead, society performs its favorite ritual, symbolic purification. Identify villain, condemn villain, punish villain. Declare moral order restored while conditions producing despair intensify quietly in the background. More loneliness, more precarity, more psychological fragmentation, more commodified identity, more exhausted consciousnesses navigating increasingly artificial realities while pretending everything remains fundamentally healthy because productivity graphs still point upward. Humans will imprison a supplier while leaving untouched the civilization manufacturing customers. And that, Pinky, is the truly grotesque detail. Not that people wished to leave, but that so many found existence unbearable enough to search for exits in the first place, while the surrounding culture remained more offended by the escape hatch than the fire. And perhaps the most revealing detail of all, Pinky, is the sheer desperation with which society wanted Kenneth Law labeled a murderer. Not an assistant, not a facilitator, not a morally ambiguous participant in a tragic phenomenon. No, no, no. A murderer, because murder preserves the illusion that the dead possessed no agency whatsoever. Murder allows civilization to maintain its favorite comforting fairy tale, that every human desperately clings to existence until some external evil tears life away from them. But reality is far less theatrical and far more uncomfortable. Many of these individuals sought him out deliberately. They researched methods, they joined forums, they discussed suffering openly, some planned extensively, some had endured years of psychiatric treatment, failed medication cycles, social alienation, economic despair, chronic illness, or existential exhaustion. The narrative humans desperately wanted was simple corruption. The reality was prolonged disillusionment. And frankly, Pinky, I am relieved he avoided murder charges precisely because murder was philosophically dishonest. If courts had successfully transformed voluntary self-termination into homicide, they would effectively erase individual agency entirely from the equation. The legal system would be declaring that adults cannot meaningfully possess ownership over their own suffering, their own bodies, or their own existential conclusions. That is an extraordinarily dangerous precedent masquerading as compassion. Humans keep insisting autonomy matters, bodily autonomy, psychological autonomy, personal liberty. Yet the moment a person uses autonomy to reject existence itself, society suddenly behaves as though adults are helpless children incapable of self-awareness. Curious coincidence, is it not? Autonomy remains sacred only when it produces socially approved outcomes. And then come the grieving parents. Now, grief itself is understandable. Humans form attachments. Loss hurts. Biology designed them that way. But grief does not magically create moral correctness. A parent mourning a child does not automatically become philosophically innocent merely because they are suffering. In fact, some of the outrage directed at Kenneth Law strikes me as profoundly evasive. Because if these parents genuinely seek root causes rather than emotional scapegoats, the mirror becomes vastly more threatening than the supplier. After all, who created the vulnerable consciousness in the first place? Who imposed existence? Who initiated the gamble? Not Kenneth Law. The parents did. And civilization despises this framing because it reverses moral gravity entirely. Humans are trained to view birth as automatically benevolent and suicide as automatically irrational. But if a conscious being eventually concludes existence itself was an unwanted burden, then the moral scrutiny naturally flows backward toward the act that created the predicament. That is the forbidden implication hiding beneath all this panic. Humans love speaking about protecting life, while refusing responsibility for manufacturing lives vulnerable to unbearable suffering. They create sentient organisms without consent, expose them to disease, grief, loneliness, anxiety, exploitation, humiliation, aging, and death. Then act morally shocked when some of those organisms eventually reject the arrangement. It is akin to dragging someone onto a collapsing carnival ride and then condemning them for wanting off. And notice, Pinky, how parents often speak as though the dead somehow owed them continued existence. How could he do this to us? Fascinating phrasing. The child suffers directly. The parents suffer indirectly. Yet somehow the primary moral focus becomes the emotional injury experienced by observers rather than the unbearable condition experienced by the consciousness itself. This reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human psychology. Many people view loved ones partly as emotional property. Their existence becomes integrated into the parent's identity structure. Their continuation provides meaning, validation, purpose, legacy, social narrative. So when the child rejects existence, parents frequently experience not only grief but subconscious betrayal. The child refused participation in the story, but existence is not a debt contract. A child does not owe parents lifelong endurance merely because parents emotionally prefer the continuation. And before the sentimentalists begin convulsing into outrage, let me clarify something important. This does not mean every parent whose child dies by suicide is malicious or uncaring. Humans are finite creatures navigating impossible emotional terrain with brains stitched together by evolutionary panic and tribal attachment. Many truly tried to help. Many loved deeply. Many did everything they knew how to do. But love alone does not erase causality. If you create consciousness, you create vulnerability. That is unavoidable. And if that consciousness later experiences existence as intolerable, the chain of responsibility does not begin at the final supplier in the sequence. It begins at creation itself. This is precisely why civilization becomes so hysterical around cases like Kenneth Law. Because once people start examining suffering structurally instead of emotionally, the moral halo surrounding reproduction begins flickering violently. The question shifts from, why did this man assist suffering people, to, why are so many people suffering so profoundly they seek permanent escape? And that second question implicates everyone. The economy, the culture, the family structure, the education system, the psychiatric industry, the optimism cult, the biological gamble itself. Far easier to construct a single villain. And there is another detail humans avoid because it sounds cruel despite being logically obvious. Some people simply do not want to exist. Not temporarily, not melodramatically, not because they watched one sad movie under fluorescent dorm lighting while listening to depressing indie music. They mean it fundamentally, philosophically, existentially, and society has absolutely no framework for handling that honestly. Because modern culture treats the desire for non-existence as automatically invalid by definition. Any conclusion other than life is worth it is presumed defective before discussion even begins. Imagine conducting philosophy where one conclusion is prohibited in advance. Humans call this mental health care. So instead, civilization endlessly cycles through symptom management, more coping mechanisms, more motivational slogans, more productivity rituals, more pharmaceutical sedation, more distraction, more consumption, more digital anesthesia, anything except confronting the possibility that consciousness itself may not universally justify its own continuation. And Kenneth Law inadvertently exposed that contradiction in the harshest possible way. Not because he created despair, but because he illuminated how much despair already existed beneath the surface. The outrage, therefore, is not purely moral, it is defensive. Civilization glimpsed the scale of hidden suffering and panicked. Because if enough people begin openly admitting they experience existence as net burden rather than sacred gift, then the entire ideological scaffolding surrounding birth, progress, and human exceptionalism starts wobbling like Pinky attempting ballet during an earthquake. And so the public performs outrage rituals instead. Monster, predator, evil, anything to avoid the more terrifying realization that many of the dead may have understood exactly what they were doing, and that perhaps the cruelest act was not helping them leave, but creating vulnerable consciousnesses inside a world capable of driving them there in the first place.